I believe we're in a kind of end stage right now. It's a very dramatic moment. Maybe our mainstream media don't fully appreciate it, but we have some crucial decisions to make just in the next weeks. Here's why. Ukraine is in terrible trouble. The counteroffensive has failed. The devastation to Ukraine has been immense. It's really been a bloodbath. Ukraine has been worn down terribly by this failed counteroffensive with massive loss of people and a massive loss of hardware. And Russia is probably going to launch a major counteroffensive, and a very dangerous one, very soon. That's not for sure, but I think that that is likely. And I think the consequences for everybody, starting with Ukraine and Europe and the world, could be very, very grave if we don't move to negotiation now to save Ukraine first and foremost. Now, my view has been all along that this was a war that could have been avoided at many points, that it is a war caused basically by the U.S. idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine and even to Georgia on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. It's an old U.S. idea. It's even an older British idea because it was basically the British imperial idea of the Crimean War to remove Russian power from the Black Sea. And Brzezinski in the 1990s revived this idea, and our neoconservatives in the United States have tried to put it into place for more than 25 years. So this is a war that has deep roots in U.S. Unilateralism and neoconservatism. This is not how the war is portrayed in our media, which absolutely deny people the history that they need. As everybody knows, I'm sure, in this room, Hans Dietrich Genscher and James Baker were very explicit with President Gorbachev. NATO will not move eastward. The United States cheated. Germany went along with it. And the eastward expansion of NATO started under Clinton, and it accelerated under George Bush with 7 new NATO members in 2004. But the huge, decisive moment was pushing Ukraine's membership in NATO at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. And we know that Chancellor Merkel was very much against this, as were most of the European leaders. But frankly, European leaders don't stand up to the United States, just like your chancellor today never stands up to the United States, I'm afraid. And so when the U.S. pushed for a commitment for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia, even though the European leaders knew this was deeply dangerous and misguided, and our own U.S. diplomats knew that this was dangerous and misguided, NATO went ahead with this commitment because the U.S. pressured all the rest of the leaders. And so Ukraine's membership in NATO was promised. This has proved to be devastating for Ukraine. When Yanukovych became president in 2010, he wisely called for neutrality. And neutrality was passed by the Rada, and it became the state law. Then, of course, as you know, the neocons in the United States aimed to overthrow Yanukovych. And however you depict the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. It was a U.S. regime change operation to a significant extent. This is obvious for anybody that cares to look. Again, our media deny the obvious. It happens that Russia intercepted a call of Victoria Nuland that explains it all, because 3 weeks before the violent coup that overthrew Yanukovych, Victoria Nuland was already choosing the new government of Ukraine. So as soon as Yanukovych was overthrown, President Putin retook Crimea so that Sevastopol, the naval base of Russia since 1783, would not fall into NATO hands. And to break away regions of Ukraine, rejected the coup-led government, which was a Russophobic Western Ukrainian government, hostile to Russian ethnic Ukrainians. And these two provinces broke away, Donetsk and Lugansk, and violence broke out. The war started in 2014. And of course, the Minsk agreements were negotiated to stop the war. And Germany and France were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement. But as even Chancellor Merkel told us in interviews last year, nobody took the Minsk agreement seriously in the West. Russia took it seriously, but neither Ukraine, nor Germany, nor the United States, nor France took it seriously. And so the autonomy that was promised for the Donbass was not followed through by the Ukrainian governments. Instead, the United States started to arm a massive army, beginning really with the arms buildup in 2018 and 2019. And this army threatened, as your generals have made clear, to storm the Donbass in 2021 and early 2022. This is the truth. This is not Putin propaganda or Putin apology. This is the U.S. neoconservatives pushing NATO against Russia's red lines and knowing that war would come from this. Even there's a video of Zelensky's senior advisor, Arestovich, in 2019, very clearly saying, we know that pursuing NATO means war with Russia, but we're ready for war with Russia. So we knowingly provoked this war because of this desire to end Russia's great power status by surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region. And the plan all along was that Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would completely surround Russia and the Black Sea. And this would, in the theory of Brzezinski and going back to the 19th century, make it impossible for Russia to project its power in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. On December 17, 2021, as you know, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement to avert the war. And the agreement called for several things, but the most important was an end to NATO enlargement. I personally called the White House after that agreement was put onto the table and really urged President Biden to negotiate. But the U.S. position, and it is the formal NATO position, is that NATO enlargement is none of Russia's business. This is the so-called open door policy, that only NATO and the counterpart, in this case Ukraine, have any say in NATO enlargement, and Russia's interests have no bearing whatsoever. This is sheer reckless arrogance. That's America for you. And this is how we get into wars, because we refused to negotiate over the expansion of NATO. Now, mind you, think of the context in which Russia viewed this. First, the United States had unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and the United States was putting missiles into Central and Eastern Europe, starting with Poland and Romania. Russia vociferously objected. The United States said it's none of your business. The U.S., of course, launched wars repeatedly. Serbia, 1999, Afghanistan, 2001, Iraq, 2003, Syria, 2011, Libya, 2011, Ukraine, 2014, with the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. The U.S. refused to negotiate on any of these matters. The U.S. unilaterally built a massive army in Ukraine. This is what Russia saw and faced in early 2022. I'm just explaining this war. I'm not justifying it, I'm explaining it. We walked eyes open into a war. Of course, the United States thought that the sanctions regime, that cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system would bring down the Russian economy. This was stupid, but this was the belief of senior U.S. officials. Senior U.S. officials thought that Putin would not mobilize in Russia, that he would be politically too weak. This was, again, extraordinarily naive, because from Russia's point of view, this question of NATO enlargement is an existential question. It's not just a minor point. It's an existential question. So the United States provoked this war. Putin launched the special military operation. Within 2 weeks, Zelensky called for negotiations based on Ukraine's neutrality. And as you know, at the end of March, there was actually a document about to be signed by Russia and Ukraine based on neutrality, and that would have ended the war. The United States intervened and stopped that agreement. Do you read about it in the mainstream media? No. But this is what happened. And I've spoken to the negotiators, and I flew to Ankara to get a proper briefing about all of this. And I've spoken to many people about this. And the United States blocked this because the United States said to Zelensky, you can defeat Russia. You don't have to accept neutrality, because this project of NATO enlargement was the project of Biden, Nuland, Blinken, and Sullivan. And your government has stood up and cheered all the way, especially your foreign minister, as has much of Europe. It's very sad. Now, what was clear from the beginning is that the sanctions would not crush the Russian economy or prevent Russia from prosecuting this war. It was also clear from the beginning that the so-called wonder weapons of NATO would not be sufficient if Russia chose to fight a war of attrition, because Russia is much larger than Ukraine, because Russia's military-industrial complex is even proportionately larger than Ukraine's. And because for Russia, this was not a small issue where Putin was just going to go away. This was an existential issue. And so again, our generals so frequently do exactly what they've done in Ukraine. All my life, U.S. generals have said victory is just around the corner. They said it in Vietnam. They said it in Iraq. They said it in Libya. They said it in Syria. They said it in Afghanistan. And they said it in Ukraine. Don't worry, everything's under control. But clearly, where we are today, nothing is under control. Ukraine has suffered grievously on the battlefield and in the destruction of infrastructure and in the flight of 10 million people or more, and in the annexation of vast territory with many millions more, and with so many dead and wounded each day and week. And the United States just keeps saying, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. And you know, our senators have the audacity to say, we're getting our money's worth because no Americans are dying, we're weakening Russia, and we're showing China that we're strong. This is actually what grown-ups in the United States say. It's hideous. How can a senator say such a thing? So profoundly immoral and so profoundly stupid, by the way. Russia's not being weakened by this. Russian military is being strengthened by this. We're not showing China how tough we are. We're depleting our arsenals and showing that Russia can take on the NATO military armaments and hold them at bay. And what does fighting in Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians conceivably have to do with showing China that we're tough? The very idea is appalling. But actually, I'm quoting the senior members of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. This is the line that actually the politicians in Washington use, that this is about China. And in the meantime, Ukraine is in desperate shape. Now, let me say that the situation is even more adverse because the awfulness of this is dawning on more and more people. In the elections yesterday, or today, I guess, yesterday or today, because it's time zone difference, in Slovakia, yesterday's election, sorry, a government was just brought to power that ran the campaign on the basis of stopping all support for Ukraine. Poland has announced it's stopping all support for Ukraine. Hungary, of course, has opposed this adventure all along, saying that this was a neocon illusion, not some pro-Ukrainian initiative. So Ukraine is losing its support in Europe one by one. There is not a senior politician in a Western European country that has an approval rating higher than the disapproval rating. Western European politicians are all unpopular. This war is deeply unpopular. The economic boomerang effects are deeply unpopular. What this has done to the German economy is deeply unpopular. And the US blowing up Nord Stream didn't help. So Europe has pulled back. Then, ladies and gentlemen, you probably saw that the United States Congress rejected Biden's call for more financial support for Ukraine in the last-minute maneuvers yesterday that kept the U.S. government functioning with this so-called continuing resolution. That's a kind of stopgap legislation that is passed to keep the government going for another couple of months while the deeper budget debate continues. But President Biden was trying to put in $6 billion of short-term help for Ukraine into that continuing resolution. And it failed. In fact, the continuing resolution succeeded only when the money for Ukraine was taken off the table. And this is because the Republican Party in the United States, both in the base of the membership of the party in the United States and increasingly in the leaders of the party in Washington, are opposed to more spending for Ukraine. Now, they have mixed reasons for this. Some is fiscal policy. Some is that they want to spend the money to fight China, not to fight Russia. Some just don't believe in the war. There's a mixed set of motives, but the Republicans do not want to fund this war anymore, and the Republicans control the lower house of our Congress. So that's another reality. So if you add this up, Ukraine having lost in its counteroffensive, losing support in Europe, losing support in the United States, and facing the prospect of a massive offensive by Russia, that's still only a hypothesis, but it's a possible one. What to do? Well, if you are Britain, it's clear. Britain says we should escalate. Britain is sending British military to Ukraine now for on-site training. The British, in my view, are a little crazy, still with the nostalgia for their empire, still fighting the first Crimean War, they think. So I try to put the British view away because it is a nonsense and a danger. What we need to do is not to escalate further, which could end up with the full destruction of Ukraine or an escalation to nuclear war, as we know. We need to understand that all of this all along has fit Clausewitz's famous formulation that war is the continuation of politics with other means. We need to face the politics of this issue. This is a war over NATO enlargement and an internal war between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. And the way that could have kept Ukraine safe and secure would have been neutrality and diversity, a federal structure for Ukraine, recognizing the Russian language and Russian culture, and not having a culture conflict as well as a NATO enlargement. But we've gotten the worst of both worlds, pushing NATO enlargement and a Russophobic Western Ukrainian regime absolutely spewing hate, maybe understandable, but hate against Russia that is totally destructive of peace prospects. So we need to come back to the politics. And in my mind, the politics are roughly the following. I think that there are at least 4 components to a peace agreement. The first and fundamental one is stop NATO enlargement eastward. Stop already. This is so dangerous and provocative. And it's, since Ukraine's not going to join NATO, to keep promising that it will when the war is over means perpetual war or outright defeat of Ukraine. So stop NATO enlargement. Stop this absurdity of this so-called open door policy. Understand that NATO enlargement does concern Russia, and that Russia should have a say in this. And that we should remember the promises that Genscher and Kohl and Baker made back in 1990. Anyway, this whole approach has been wrong, driven by U.S. unipolar aspirations. So the first point is stop the NATO enlargement as part of a peace agreement. The second is very difficult now, what to do about the territories. You know, in 2014, Russia wasn't claiming any territories. Then Yanukovych was overthrown, and Russia, it just claimed the Minsk II agreement. But then the Minsk II agreement was repudiated, so Russia claimed the territory of the Donbass. We keep refusing common sense, and the situation keeps getting worse and worse. At this point, there does need to be border change negotiated. And we have to understand that sometimes borders do change. The United States forced a border change of Serbia to put Kosovo out of Serbia. That was a NATO operation, bombing Belgrade for 49 straight days in order to change the border. And the United States did the same with Sudan, siding with the insurgency of South Sudan to change the border. So we're going to have to negotiate borders to reach peace. Crimea certainly is going to remain in Russian hands. The heavy Russian ethnic populations of Ukraine are going to be in Russian hands in the end if we want peace. So that's a second point that I think is obvious. A third point is the United States and Russia need to get back to nuclear arms negotiations. The U.S. never should have abandoned the ABM treaty. The U.S. never should have abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which it did in 2019. Now the New START treaty is in suspension. We need the nuclear negotiations to resume. And the United States has to accept that Russia is right, actually, about this danger of the placement of Aegis missiles without negotiating with Russia. This is destabilizing the nuclear situation. So that's a third plank that is needed. And a fourth plank is to return to the concept of collective security of the OSCE. Because the OSCE is based specifically on the point that no country can choose a military alliance in a way that endangers another country. Unlike the NATO open door doctrine, so-called, that NATO doesn't have to talk to Russia, the whole OSCE is premised on collective security, that no country can take measures that jeopardize a neighboring country. And this is the right point. OSCE is truly Europe's best path for security. I should mention, by the way, that while I was against NATO enlargement all along, I would be very clear, NATO will not retreat from where it is, but it will stop expanding. NATO should not, in these negotiations, leave the Baltic states or leave Romania or Bulgaria or others. No, it can't do that. But it can accept that it will stop the Eastern enlargement. Finally, let me say that while it seems impossible today, I firmly believe that normal relations with Russia should be established between Germany and Russia, and in fact between the European Union and Russia. And by normal relations, I mean trade and finance and tourism and culture. this idea that we are siding to never again speak with Russia or listen to Rachmaninoff or play a Tchaikovsky ballet or have a Russian soprano sing in our opera houses is reprehensible, in my view. What are we doing? We made a terrible political mistake to go deeper and deeper into conflict with Russia rather than operating with respect and actually with consistency. We crossed Russia's red lines knowingly and repeatedly. We overthrew a government in Ukraine. We don't admit any of this, by the way, in the mainstream media. I'm attacked every day for simply repeating the historical truths. So be it. I don't care. These are the truths. And this is the way to peace. We need to understand this is politics, and we need to return to politics. This issue will not be solved. Ukraine will not be saved on the battlefield. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Ambassadors, Secretary General, NDB President Rousseff, distinguished diplomats, ladies and gentlemen. Today's meeting takes place at a time of several major wars. In my testimony, I will refer to four. The Ukraine War, which started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych. The Israel-Palestine War, which has flared repeatedly since 1967. The Syrian War, which began in 2011. And the Sahel Wars, which began in 2012 in Mali and have now spread throughout the Sahel. These wars may seem intractable, but they are not. Indeed, I would suggest that all four wars could be ended quickly by agreement within the UN Security Council. One reason is that major wars must be fed from the outside, both with external finances and armaments. The UN Security Council could agree to choke off these awful wars by withholding external finance and armaments. This would require an agreement among the major powers. The other reason why these wars can end quickly is that they result from economic and political factors that can be addressed through diplomacy rather than through war. By addressing the underlying political and economic factors, the Security Council can establish conditions for peace and sustainable development. Let me consider each of the four wars in turn briefly. The war in Ukraine has two main political causes. The first is the attempt by NATO to expand to Ukraine despite the timely and repeated objections by Russia. Russia considers NATO presence in Ukraine as a significant threat to Russia's security. The second political cause is the East-West ethnic division in Ukraine, partly along linguistic and partly along religious lines. Following the overthrow of President Yanukovych in 2014, ethnic Russian regions broke away from the post-coup government and appealed for protection and autonomy. The Minsk II agreement, endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2202, called for regional autonomy to be incorporated in Ukraine's constitution, but the agreement was never implemented by Ukraine, despite the UN Security Council backing. The economic cause of the war results from the fact that Ukraine's economy faces both west to the European Union and east to Russia, Central Asia, and East Asia. When the EU tried to negotiate a free trade agreement with Ukraine, Russia expressed alarm that its own trade and investments in Ukraine would be undermined unless a three-way agreement was reached among the EU, Russia, and Ukraine to ensure that Ukrainian-Russian trade and investment would be sustained alongside EU-Ukrainian trade. This is a well-known event in trade negotiations. Unfortunately, the EU was apparently not prepared to negotiate with Russia over such a three-way arrangement, and the competing east-west orientation of Ukraine's economy was never resolved. This Council could end the Ukraine war quickly by addressing its underlying political and economic causes. On the political front, the P5 countries should agree to extend a security guarantee to Ukraine while also agreeing that NATO will not expand to Ukraine, thereby addressing Russia's concerns over NATO enlargement. The Council should also work to achieve a lasting governance solution regarding Ukraine's ethnic divisions. On the economic side, there are two considerations. one in policy and the other in finance. On policy, Ukraine's strong economic interest is to join the European Union while also maintaining open trade and financial relations with Russia and the rest of Eurasia. Ukraine's trade policy should be inclusive rather than diversionary, allowing Ukraine to serve as a vibrant economic bridge across the east and west of Eurasia. On the financing side, Ukraine will need funding for reconstruction and for new physical infrastructure such as fast rail, renewable energy, 5G, and port modernization. As I described below, I recommend that the Security Council establish a new peace and development fund to help mobilize the financing to help Ukraine and other war zones to turn away from war towards recovery and long-term sustainable development. Consider in a similar way the war in Israel and Palestine. Here, too, the war could be ended quickly by the Council enforcing the many UN Security Council resolutions made over several decades, calling for a return to the 1967 borders, an end of Israel's settlement activities in the occupied territories, and the two-state solution, including in UN Security Council's resolutions 242, 338, 1397, 1515, and 2334. It is clear that Israel and Palestine are unable to reach agreements in line with these UN Security Council resolutions. On both sides, hardliners repeatedly frustrate moderates who seek peace based on the two-state solution. It is high time, therefore, in my view, for the UN Security Council to enforce its decisions by implementing a just and lasting solution that is in the interests of both Israel and Palestine, rather than allowing hardliners on both sides to ignore the mandate of this council and thereby to threaten global peace. My recommendation to this council is that it immediately recognize the state of Palestine in a matter of days or weeks and welcome Palestine as a full member of the United Nations, with the capital in East Jerusalem and with sovereign control over the Islamic holy sites. The Council should establish a peacekeeping force drawn heavily from the neighboring Arab countries to help provide security in Palestine. Such an outcome is in the overwhelming will of the international community and the manifest interest of both Israel and Palestine, despite the vociferous objections by hardline rejectionists on both sides of the divide. An economic strategy should accompany the political strategy. Most importantly, the new sovereign state of Palestine must be economically viable, and I give several examples of how that can be done. But most importantly, both Israel and Palestine should become part of an integrated sustainable development plan for the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East that supports climate resilience and the region's transition to green energy. The Council could similarly end the war in Syria. The Syrian war broke out in 2011 when several regional powers and the United States joined forces to topple the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This deeply misguided regime change operation failed, but it triggered a prolonged war with enormous bloodshed and destruction, including of ancient cultural heritage sites. The Council should make clear that all P5 countries and the countries in Syria's neighborhood are in full agreement that all regime change attempts are now permanently ended and that the UN Security Council intends to work closely with the Syrian government on reconstruction and development. On the economic side, Syria's best hope is to become closely integrated into the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East region, especially through the construction of physical infrastructure connecting Syria with Turkey, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean nations. The war in the Sahel has similar roots. Just as the regional powers in the U.S. aimed to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad in 2011, the NATO powers similarly aimed to overthrow the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. In pursuing this aim, they grossly exceeded the mandate of UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which had authorized the protection of Libya's civilian population, but certainly not authorized a NATO-led regime change. The violent overthrow of the Libyan government quickly spilled over to the impoverished countries of the Sahel. Poverty alone made these Sahelian countries highly vulnerable to the influx of armaments and militias. The result has been ongoing violence and multiple coups, gravely undermining the possibility of economic improvement. The countries of the Sahel form a natural aggregation for regional economic investment in infrastructure. The entire region urgently needs investments in electrification, digital access, water and sanitation, and road and rail transport, as well as in social services, notably education and healthcare. As the Sahel is among the poorest regions of the world, if not the poorest, the governments are utterly unable to finance the needed investments. Here, too, and perhaps more than in any other region, the Sahel needs external funding to make the transition from war to peace and from extreme poverty to sustainable development. All P5 members, and indeed the whole world, have suffered adverse consequences from the continuation of these wars. All countries are paying a price in terms of financial burdens, economic instability, risks of terrorism, and risks of wider war. The Security Council is in a position to take decisive actions to end the wars precisely because it is clear that the interests of all UN Security Council members, and notably all of the P5 countries, is to bring these long-standing wars to an end before they escalate into even more dangerous conflicts. The Security Council is vested with considerable powers by the UN Charter when it has the resolve of its members. It can introduce peacekeepers and even armies if necessary. It can impose economic sanctions on countries that do not comply with UN Security Council resolutions. It can provide security guarantees to nations. It can make referrals to the International Criminal Court to stop war crimes. In short, the Council is certainly able to enforce its resolutions if it chooses to do so. For the sake of global peace, let the Council now choose to end these wars. The UN Security Council can also bolster its toolkit by engaging in economic peace building alongside the more usual decisions on borders, peacekeepers, sanctions, and the like. I've mentioned already several times the idea of creating a new peace and development fund that the UN Security Council could deploy to create positive dynamics for sustainable development and to work with other investors such as the World Bank, the IMF, the regional development banks such as the NDB, and others to co-invest in peacemaking. I would recommend 3 guideposts for such a fund. First, it would be funded by the major powers by transferring a part of their military outlays to global peacemaking. The U.S., for example, now spends roughly $1 trillion per year on the military, while China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia are the next biggest spenders, with combined military spending roughly half of the U.S. Suppose that these countries reduce military outlays by just 10% and redirect the savings to the Peace and Development Fund. That alone would free up around $160 billion per year. Second, the fund would emphasize regional integration. This is paramount for peacemaking as well as for successful development. Ukraine would be helped to integrate both West and East. Israel, Palestine, and Syria would all be helped to integrate in a network of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. The Sahel countries would be helped to break their isolation and lack of services through a network of infrastructure. Third, the Peace and Development Fund would partner with other funding streams such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, the European Union's Global Gateway, the G7's Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, and increased lending by the Bretton Woods institutions and the regional development banks, as the Secretary General has called for in the SDG stimulus. Interestingly, the Fund for Peace and Development could be a vehicle for greater investment partnerships that links China, the EU, the United States, and the G7. This too would be a contribution towards peace, not only into ending today's wars, but into increasing cooperation among the world's major powers. Directly across the street from us is Isaiah's wall, with the visionary words of the great Jewish prophet of the 8th century BCE. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. It is time to honor Isaiah's words by ending these useless and destructive wars, slashing military outlays and turning the savings into new investments in education, healthcare, renewable energy, and social protection. As an American, I am proud that our greatest president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the visionary who oversaw the establishment of this great institution. I firmly believe in the capacity of the United Nations and of this Security Council to keep the peace and to promote sustainable development. When all 193 UN member states, or 194 with the membership of Palestine, live up to the UN Charter, we will have a new global age of peace and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will start with the questions, if I may, right away. You have experienced a lot. You are one of the most famous scholars in the world, and you have witnessed many serious events, being the war in Vietnam, the collapse of the Soviet Union, invasion of the United States and its allies in Iraq, Afghanistan. However, today, often we hear that the situation at the moment is actually the most serious as it was, the most threatening as it was after the Second World War. Do you share this opinion?
We certainly have really grave dangers. We also have good solutions to these if we keep our head on and if we're honest about the situation. Of course, there have been moments of absolutely immediate peril. I think back 61 years, and I remember it actually, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were just within a moment of nuclear war, and it was only extraordinarily wise leadership by President Kennedy and by Nikita Khrushchev that pulled the two countries back from the brink of complete disaster for the world. We're not standing at the edge exactly that way, but boy, are we creating risks like the war in Ukraine, which is really a war between the United States and Russia. Though it's being fought in Ukraine by Ukrainians, it's a proxy war. And now this war in Gaza, which is a war fought by Israel, but made possible by the United States and is extremely dangerous. And the high tensions between the United States and China, which, again, I blame the United States for as the main reason. Add those up, it's a bad situation. But then add on top of that the fact that we have the man-made dangers of environmental destruction, climate change, pollution, destruction of our fisheries and our forests, that is very serious, very far along, and even denied by many political leaders. We still have political leaders who are scientifically ignorant, who aggressively deny what is absolutely facing us, which is terrible destabilization of the physical systems for our food supplies, our forests, our fisheries, and so forth. So you add this all up, it's a terribly difficult and bad time. And maybe what makes everyone so nervous on top of it is that the quality of political leadership is extremely low. Our president is 81 years old and should be in retirement. This is absolutely obvious. Our Congress is quite corrupt in the United States because we have a system of campaign financing that depends on billions and billions of dollars going from big companies to the congressmen and senators. And the U.S. isn't alone in this. There's a great deal of instability, and our political leaders don't know how to get along with each other. So you add this all up, it's definitely bad. Whether it's absolutely the worst, it's a little hard to judge, but it's bad enough that we ought to do something about it.
You actually mentioned many questions that I was going to ask, but if I understand correctly, how did we get there actually? So definitely there is some kind of crisis of leadership, because I believe that the problem is not only a senior American president, these problems can be also in other countries. Then, of course, there's a concentration of unprecedented crises. And of course, there is a part, I would say, That's considering the decisions that the superpowers make. Would you agree with this combination?
I think if I could put one word on the reason we're in this crisis, it is arrogance. Arrogance of the rich and the powerful. And the United States was the richest and the most powerful of all during this period. So the arrogance of the United States has been extremely notable. You know, when the Cold War ended in 1989 in Central Europe and in 1991 in the former Soviet Union, we might have said, now we have a glorious opportunity for peace, for cooperation, and for prosperity. This didn't happen. It could have happened. I was there. I saw what could have been done. Instead, the United States said, we won, we're the best, we're the most powerful, we don't have to deal with anybody except on our own terms. And the United States absolutely went from arrogant to hyper arrogant and said, we can do what we want, where we want. And strangely enough, though the United States basically faced no security threats after that time, it went to war more often than ever. Of course, it completely misjudged two things. One, it continued to think of Russia as a natural enemy, and so it actually created a new enemy, because I was advisor to Gorbachev, I was advisor to Yeltsin. They wanted absolute peace and normal relations. There's no doubt in my mind. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a plot. It was an attempt to create normal relations. The United States instead said, oh, no, we won. We won. Now we'll move NATO. Okay, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland. Oh, we'll keep moving. We'll go to the Baltics. We'll go to Romania, Bulgaria. We'll go to the Balkans. Oh, no. We'll go to Ukraine. We'll go to Georgia. We'll surround Russia. We'll decolonize Russia. That's a term used in American political circles. Even saying, oh, Russia should be dismembered now. Well, what on earth are these people thinking? Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, a powerful army, a self-respect, and a desire for its own security. And so the United States provoked what absolutely it should not have provoked. So this was a part of the issue. A second part of the issue is that, in general, the rich became arrogant in a different way, saying, oh, we're so good. We used to be millionaires. Now we're billionaires. We don't have to share anything. So they became libertarian in philosophy. Libertarian in American philosophy means we don't have to pay taxes because what we have is ours and nobody's going to take it away. And so we developed a super rich class that became very self-righteous. That's my money. It's nobody else's money. How dare the government think to take it? And at the same time, a growing amount of people struggling in poverty or losing jobs to technology, being replaced by robots, being replaced by automation. So the gap in our society between the rich and the poor widened considerably. And this was the second factor. And you would think that in a political democracy, the poor people would vote out the ones that are leaning on them, or would vote for tax increases on the small group of very powerful. But that theory is wrong, because the small group of very powerful buy the politicians. They really do. And so they pay the campaign contributions. And the first rule of the U.S. Congress is vote tax cuts for companies and rich individuals. So that is the second thing that happened. The third thing that happened is that the environmental crises, especially the climate change crisis, came and would require changes in our behavior and would also cause limitations to the big energy industry, the oil, the gas, the coal industry. And the industry resisted those changes, said no. And the politicians said, oh, it's not even real. Like Václav Klaus and others, they just denied the climate change. And this denial has gone on for decades. Actually, we just saw a new president of Argentina elected just now, who said that climate change is a socialist plot. You can't even make this up. I don't know whether this is just playing games to get elected, whether it's complete sheer ignorance, whether it's corruption. I don't know what it is, but it's shocking. People in any kind of responsibility should know better. They should at least understand what this issue is about. And this has been a very big challenge. It's, again, part of the arrogance. I happen to lead a scientific institute at Columbia University with hundreds of climate scientists. So I had an earful all the time about the climate science. Many people don't have that chance to hear directly. So they hear from politicians or actors who want to be politicians, who say whatever they feel like. And the result is that we go decade after decade without solving these problems, despite all the meetings, the treaties, the conferences, and so forth. So when you add all of this up, as I said, I think the underlying problem is arrogance of the rich and the powerful, who somehow think the rules don't apply to them. And we end up in a world that is in conflict. We end up in a world that is divided between rich and poor. We end up in a world that is facing massive environmental crises. And it's all so weird because the world's richer than ever before, better technologies than ever before. And we could, if we chose right, move to peace immediately. I just testified in the UN Security Council about 4 wars: the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Palestine, the war in Syria, and the war in the Sahel of Africa, which is Burkina, Mali, Chad, Niger. And I pointed out all 4 of these huge wars could be stopped tomorrow with politics, with basic sound politics. But our leaders are just incapable of basic sound politics, unfortunately.
When you mentioned arrogance and the beginning of the 90s, well, I am from the Czech Republic, as you know, myself. So yes, we have vast experience with neoliberal policies and their application. However, I wanted to ask about liberal democracy. Of course, we have to mention Francis Fukuyama and his end of history. And now we see how completely wrong that was. But do you see also the liberal democracy as something that maybe hides more the true state of affairs than actually helps to resolve the conflicts? Because, when scholars like Martin Wolf suggest that maybe instead of voting, we should have some, choice by chance randomly, that would be better than elect the representatives that we have. There's certainly something wrong. So maybe if you could elaborate on the liberal democracy, and maybe it really will be an end, but the question is what kind of end it will be.
It would be great if we could make democracy work, because democracy is very attractive in principle. It's a way for free people to express themselves. It's a way for people to participate. It's a way for people to learn about social and political realities. So it, in principle, is a very attractive system. And in general, it's a way for people to have protection from their own governments, because non-democratic governments can be very, very destructive of their own people, because there's no control necessarily over government. So in principle, I'm a Democrat, but in practice, you can see all of the difficulties of making this work. A democracy needs to have an informed public. A democracy needs to have a respectful dialogue or deliberation in the public, not shouting, not even worse, violence, not hidden influence. A democracy needs to prevent being taken over by powerful interests that use the democracy as a facade, as a pretense rather than real democracy. So some democracies work pretty well. Some in Europe work reasonably well. I would say the quality of the American democracy has declined tremendously during my lifetime. Maybe that's an illusion, but I feel that, and I can see even in the data that people had more confidence in government 60 years ago than they have today. And I look at that, and I've, of course, spent my whole life trying to understand that declining confidence in our government. And I find two factors that are at the core of this. One is that after World War II, the United States created a security state with the CIA and other institutions that were supposedly ensuring national security. But in fact, they really diminished democracy, because the first principle of the CIA is that it's secret and its actions are secret. And it does lots of things around the world that are not good, but they're secret. So this really undermined American democracy. And we don't have much public effect on foreign policy, for example, in the United States, because when it comes to foreign policy, really the president and a few other people make decisions on behalf of everybody without public debate or without control by any really democratic institutions, other than a vote once every few years. But that's not enough, because we go to war all the time against the interests of the American people. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I mentioned earlier is the big money in politics. Some countries restrict private campaign financing. In fact, most in Europe don't have a lot of corruption of the political system. But the United States, I regard as kind of legal corruption, legal in the sense that our Supreme Court said that companies can spend whatever they want on politics, no restriction, or few restrictions. And the result is our election cycle, say the 2024 election, will spend maybe $15 billion of campaign financing. Now, you don't get honest government with so much money changing hands. You get government that is purchased by the highest bidder. And this is why the confidence in democracy has declined so much.
You mentioned, of course, the power of big money. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the situation in Europe. I just believe because the economies are weaker, then there's not so much money as in the US, but the tendency is practically the same. You mentioned Joe Biden and, of course, then President Trump. Probably they'll meet in elections next year. Probably. Do you see the crisis in leadership? Because when we look in the past, we see many strong leaders who were both from Europe, from the United States, who were able to offer some vision and lead a society. Some of them even towards a peaceful society. We mentioned Willy Brandt, Olof Palme. We can also mention Ronald Reagan as a special type of American heritage as well. I would say there is a certain decline in these leadership qualities. Do you view it as well? Because in Europe, it's, I think, very visible.
Yes, I think the quality of the political leadership in the US and Europe is very weak right now in general. Speaking of the United States, we have two leading candidates, one of whom is 81 and can't find his way off the stage anymore. He happens to be our president. And the other one is a convicted, is multiply convicted, psychologically unstable person who now faces dozens of criminal counts right now in trials coming up. So maybe we'll have an octogenarian who should never be running, and a convicted felon running for the presidency. This is a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. How can we get there? There are some other candidates. I'm hoping that Robert Kennedy Jr. Proves himself as a highly capable candidate. And I like him. We were schoolmates, we're friends, and he comes from a great political tradition. In fact, his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was, in my view, the last great American president, because after that, well, we had some very nice and smart people, a few, not very many. Jimmy Carter was one. But we've had a lot of failed presidents and failed presidencies. So the quality of leadership is quite low. And in Europe, it's also really surprising to me how when the United States makes such bad judgments, European leaders tend to follow along the U.S. lead. And of course, I'm very unhappy about the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone's unhappy about it, but I have a view that's somewhat different from the mainstream view, which is, in my interpretation, the war in Ukraine was caused by the U.S. wanting to expand NATO. Of course, many in Europe say, no, it's all Putin. He did this. But I know enough history, and I was present at enough events to know how much the U.S. provoked this war through absolutely stupid policies. Because if you're smart, you don't push a military alliance right up against Russia's border. That's just not a wise thing to do. Russia's extremely sensitive to the military of the West encroaching on it because of how many times Russia's been invaded by the West. And especially when the United States politicians have so much hostility to Russia, which they do. They openly express the idea that Russia should be dismantled and many other things. Of course, Russia's going to see NATO expansion as a direct threat to national security, and it's not going to let it happen. So this is just an example of terrible policy, predictable disaster. But the U.S. went along with it. Now, my point was, the Europeans knew better. I know because many Europeans told me many times, oh, NATO expansion to Ukraine is very dangerous. but then they don't say it in public. And they don't say it in public because the United States would get mad at them. And, you know, they're afraid of the U.S. They shouldn't be afraid of the U.S. Europe should have its own independent foreign policy, and it should understand its own interests. And the interests are not just following along the United States. So this is just a very important example of the weakness of the political leadership right now in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we see that here very well. So they're actually not able even to formulate the national interests. And I don't know if it's fear or simply they are not capable to understand what's going on. Maybe it's a combination of both. However, the consequences are really disastrous for the EU, both economically and politically, of course. You mentioned
one European political leader said to me a couple of years ago, "Oh, they don't take us seriously in Washington." And he said it even more colorfully, which I won't repeat exactly, but this was a leader of a major country. And my thought was, yeah, but you should not allow yourself to be treated that way. That's your fault. That's not America's fault. Yes, America's arrogant, but stand up for Europe. This should be the approach, but it's not the approach.
You mentioned the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, now it's not so much in spotlight as more of the news concentrates on what is going on between Israel, Hamas, and the situation in the Gaza Strip. So suddenly we see that Ukraine is not number one, at least not in the foreign policy topics. Do you see any possible way out of the conflict? I mean, a peaceful way out, or at least a satisfactory way out of this conflict? As you mentioned, this is really a proxy war. Of course, the Ukraine is a pawn simply in the game, and in effect, it's a war of Russia against NATO, especially against the United States. So, is there a possible change, for example, coming with the next election in the United States, or is it just wishful thinking?
Well, the thing we should understand, if you're playing poker and you have a lousy hand, and each time it comes to you, you raise the ante. And when the opponent matches you, meets you, you up the ante, even though your hand is lousy. Maybe you're bluffing, or maybe you don't know how to play poker. But that is what the West has done with Russia, because the West said, we're going to expand NATO to Ukraine. And at first, Russia didn't say, oh, we're going to conquer the territory. Russia just said, don't do that. We respect Ukraine's borders. And all we want is a long-term lease for our naval fleet in Sevastopol. And that was what Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, delivered between 2010 and 2013. A long-term lease for Russia and neutrality. Okay, we don't want to join NATO. It's, you know, we're in between. Then the United States and Europe really helped to overthrow Yanukovych. We should be clear about this. In February 2014, the United States played a direct role in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And they brought in an anti-Russian government. And at that point, President Putin said, okay, we're not going to let Crimea fall into NATO hands. So we'll organize a referendum, and the people of Crimea, no doubt, overwhelmingly were Russian and wanted to be part of Russia, and voted to become part of Russia. The West said, no, this is completely unacceptable. Then the Russian regions of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, of course, said, we don't like this new government. It's very radical. It's very anti-Russian. It's trying to cancel Russian culture and Russian language. We want autonomy. And the two breakaway republics of Lugansk and Donetsk took place. And
the Ukrainian government attacked them as renegade provinces, but it militarily attacked them. And then came the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, to stop the fighting. And Minsk II, in particular, was endorsed by the UN Security Council. And Russia didn't say, we're going to take the Donbass. Russia just said, honor the Minsk II agreement, which gives autonomy to these regions and respect for the Russian language and Russian culture. Pretty reasonable, actually. But the Ukrainians and the Americans said, no way. We're not going to honor an agreement, even though the UN Security Council adopted it. And so Minsk II was never implemented. And interestingly, Chancellor Merkel of Germany was supposed to be a guarantor of Minsk II. And then she admitted in a press conference a year ago, oh, we didn't really mean it. It just gave time for Ukraine to strengthen its defenses and so forth. Well, this is very cynical and very destructive. But the reason I mention it is Russia was not calling for Ukrainian territory, except we raised the stakes in this poker game. And then Russia said, okay, we'll take Crimea. And the United States said, and we want autonomy for the Russian regions. No, we raised the stakes, no autonomy. And then Russia said at the end of 1991, look, this situation is not controlled. Minsk is not being enforced. NATO is still intending to enlarge to Ukraine. This is the last chance. We demand negotiations with the United States. And President Putin put on the table a draft agreement with the U.S. on December 17, 2021. And the United States said, no, we're not negotiating any of that with you. That's arrogance. They did it again. I called the White House at the end of 2021 and spoke with senior official and said, negotiate with Russia, avoid the war. Oh, don't worry, Professor Sachs. Of course, the United States rejected negotiations and the special military operation started. Now, this is also very interesting. At the time of the special military operation, the two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, claimed independence. Russia did not annex them until September 2022. They claimed independence. Of course, the United States said no, but immediately Zelensky said, okay, we can negotiate with Russia. And in March 2022, there were negotiations, and they were actually going to reach an outcome of Ukrainian neutrality and an end to the war. And then what happened? The United States stepped in and said, no, don't do that. We don't accept that. Well, how stupid is that? You have a losing hand, but they raised the ante one more time. Now, why did they do that? Because they're basically ignorant. In this case, they didn't understand how bad their hand was. They looked at their cards and they said, we're going to impose economic sanctions, and this will bring Russia to its knees. And we will ship HIMARS missiles, and this will destroy the Russian military. This is a fantasy world of these people, these neocons in Washington. So they raised the stakes one more time. They said no to a negotiated peace. They said no to Ukrainian neutrality. And the war continued. And now where are we in this advanced stage of the war? Russia is absolutely destroying one Ukrainian army after another. This is obvious. And the much talked about Ukrainian counteroffensive that was supposed to take place in June 2023 and reach the Sea of Azov
of course, it didn't reach anything. It didn't do anything other than kill tens of thousands of Ukrainians and cost an unbelievable amount of money in destroyed tanks, weapon systems, artillery, everything. So it's been a disaster. These are the worst poker players I've ever seen. All they do with a lousy hand is keep raising the stakes and keep losing.
Maybe now they are trying to shift focus, shift attention to Gaza or maybe to some other conflicts, because actually when you are losing in one, then you can try to induce more chaos.
You asked me a question which I didn't answer. I gave a long answer.
If there is a way out.
No, but you asked me a question, what to do. And the point I would make is the first thing we should do is stop raising the ante, Stop saying, oh, we're going to defeat them. It's easy. We're going to beat them. No, Ukraine's not going to defeat Russia. And the more that this goes on, the more dead Ukrainians there are. That's just the most basic point. And the whole society has been so profoundly wounded because millions and millions of Ukrainians are in Europe or are in Russia, and hundreds of thousands are dead because of this. So the population has collapsed, and there aren't young people anymore. Now they want to draft kids and young women because they've run out of soldiers. It's terrible. And so we need to stop raising the ante. Now, what would that mean? We need to negotiate. We need to say first, okay, NATO is not enlarging, but Russia, you have to stop taking more and more Ukraine. And what the Russians are going to say at this point is, okay, we keep the following territories. And we're going to have to negotiate over that, because the idea that, no, we don't make any concessions, you're just going to be defeated, is going to end up destroying all of Ukraine. It's raising the stakes on a lousy hand. And we should recognize that we are going to need a political outcome right now, not the one we wanted, but we were so dumb not to take a better deal a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that now we're in a situation where we're not going to get exactly what we, quote, want. But to continue the fighting would absolutely destroy even more.
What worries me most is actually that really the lives of Ukrainians are just taken as a casualty, as something not even worth speaking about.
They don't even talk about it. The leadership is absolutely gross. I'm sure that Zelensky is in a very hard place, but all he talks about right now is throwing more lives to the graves. Frankly, no strategy, no self-awareness, no situational awareness. Okay, it's very sad because the United States talked him out of a peace agreement in March 2022. That was Zelensky's chance, and he lost it. He was inexperienced. When the United States comes and tells you, we have your back, you tend to believe it if you're inexperienced. I tried to tell them, by the way, I really tried to tell the Ukrainians, look, I'm an old guy. I've been through lots of U.S. wars, Vietnam War, Nicaragua, the Gulf Wars, Syria. They never win. Are you kidding? Do you really want to end up like Afghanistan? And they didn't believe me. They just thought, oh, you're a Putin apologist. So they didn't want to hear any of this. But I was telling them the hard facts about American wars, and they didn't want to hear it.
Besides Russia, I'm not sure that Ukraine actually is such a big topic in American policy. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it's
maybe
definitely diminished. It's a big focus of the political class still, the military-industrial complex and the White House. Maybe for just political reasons that Biden doesn't want to admit what a lousy poker player he is. But the point is for the American people, they've had enough. There's no groundswell of support. People don't want that. They want to stop this thing. And so in that sense, you're absolutely right. Typically, the public doesn't have much say in this. We have almost no public debate. But Biden's popularity is really collapsing. And if the unhappiness with Biden's foreign policy is very, very clear. So maybe even public opinion is going to start playing a role because we're now in an election year.
I would like to ask you to clear the position on China, because when I look both at the Republicans or at the Democrats, I would say that their views on China are very similar. So they actually have very hostile views towards China. Now there was a summit, APEC, where both presidents, Biden and Xi Jinping, met. Do you see any decline in tension, any hopes that actually the relations, they are probably not going to be friendly, but let's say at least stabilize and would be less threatening for the world?
I'll tell you an interesting thing. When President Xi came to this APEC summit in San Francisco, he met 200 U.S. business leaders, and they gave him a standing ovation. I don't think they would give an American president a standing ovation, but they gave President Xi a standing ovation. Why? China is their biggest market. They both produce in China, they sell in China, they make a lot of money in China, and they want normal relations. What is happening is two things. One, we have a kind of security class in America who are all about American dominance, American hegemony, America being number one. It's a very strange group of people. But this is our foreign policy establishment. Then we have politicians who basically think that, and it's very particular, Trump in 2016 won the election by winning swing states in the middle of America, in the American Midwest, which is our industrial zone. And he won it by saying, China took your jobs away. And when he made narrow victories in those states, the Democrats said, oh, we have to attack China in order to compete politically with Trump. So there are two reasons for the anti-China sentiment in the United States. One, and in the political class, one is this idea of America being the only dominant country. Well, I mean, you know, unless you're playing a board game like the game of Risk, you don't get to be the dominant country in the world when there are other big countries around. So this is arrogance, again, very misguided. Then there is this protectionist politics, which tries to appeal to a few swing states in the U.S. elections. The upshot of this is that the political class, both Democrats and Republicans, are pretty united against China, pretty ignorant from my experience. They don't know China. They don't know Chinese history. They don't have any perspective. They play a dangerous game, like when our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, flew to Taiwan. So stupid. Sorry. Just why do you want to provoke another superpower?
Thank you for saying that, because we have the same representatives who are also provoking China in this country.
Okay, don't provoke China. Be respectful. Just have normal relations. Don't provoke a superpower. Why? What is in it to poke a superpower? It's stupid. People should think. You know, if there's some, even if you think there's a bully, which China's not, but if you think there's a bully in the schoolyard and you're a little kid and you think they're the bully, is it really smart to go poking them and say, you're a bully, I hate you? No, you're going to get hurt in the end. So you need some common sense. And China's not even bullying. China is just big, successful,
dynamic, actually a good trade partner for Europe. So we should treat it normally, respectfully, and the U.S. anxieties should not be Europe's anxieties. This is another area where European politicians are just repeating the words of American politicians. And I know behind the scenes, although it's obvious, why does van der Leyen repeat words almost like Biden? Because she feels that her job is to be with the United States. Maybe she hopes the United States appoints her as the Secretary General of NATO or something. I don't know what it is. No, but that's what she hopes maybe. So this is where Europe makes a big mistake. Just like it did make a big mistake in Ukraine, it would make a big mistake of trying to make an enemy out of China. That's a completely ridiculous losing proposition.
My last question, because our time is coming up, I have to reflect one very current event you already mentioned, and that's the elections in Argentina.
Yes.
Because let's say that the elected president is unusual personality. How do you view this situation? Is there a danger for BRICS or maybe for other Latin American countries with his very strange suggestions as for foreign policy, as for economics?
Yeah, of course, time will tell. One thing is he won the presidency but has no control over the Congress. His small parties, and at least for the moment, doesn't have any kind of governing coalition in the Congress. So maybe his ability to do things will require a much broader coalition of forces, and that could be a constraint. But let me just say first, Argentina is a country that has been unstable for its whole history, going back to the 1820s, ever since independence. Argentina has messed up more currencies, had more inflation, and more instability than any other place on the entire planet. This guy won not because of what he says, but because of disgust with the outgoing government, which was delivering inflation of triple digits, more than 100%. You can't really win an election when inflation is triple digit. And I know Argentina quite well, and actually worked with the finance minister just before this one. And he was doing a good job, and he ended up being not forced out. He resigned, unfortunately, but he resigned because his own, I would say, corrupt politicians in his own party were rejecting the normal policies that he was trying to promote. So Argentina is now in yet another cycle of instability. All my professional career as an economist, I've been watching Argentina in amazement, because it's not an impoverished country by any means, and it's got huge natural wealth and very smart people, well-educated class of people, but it has made such a political mess repeatedly, and this could be yet another one. I don't want to say on the first day after the election of this guy that he'll really govern the way he campaigned, because sometimes they become a lot more responsible, but it could be that that he is what he says he is, in which case Argentina is going to face some real troubles. It's regrettable, because I'm a fan of the BRICS. I would like to see them work. Argentina is a new member of the BRICS group. Whether this guy stays in or out of the BRICS or gets kicked out of the BRICS, everything remains to be seen. But I only hope that this guy was making this as a persona, not as a real politics, because his real politics, if delivered this way would be very, very detrimental to Argentina.